development. Oh, maybe he's back. So I say, so just that we need to see why it had to be an autobiography, because we needed this story of the development, what we've been reading and going through this far to reach this point of maturity. And I love how he says here that we couldn't have gotten here until we reached maturity. And even at maturity is not yet the end. As he says here, right, that, such a system could scarcely be expected to reach its fullness of development short of maturity, assuming it would reach its fullness then or could ever reach it. For the world of expression is limitless. And I think this is even what we can take from this at this point in the story. The story has taken us to the maturity. The story has given us, from the idea of power, we've now gotten to the system of form follows function. And we're going to see what he does with that now, that he takes that system and what does he say? He wishes to test it out in the broad daylight of action and to perfect its form and content. But that process itself is potentially never ending. And I hope that that's what we take at this point, that now that we've gone through the story, we've reached the point of maturity, we've got the system. This is a system that we can now continually just keep experimenting with in perpetuity. And it sets us up even for the next chapter, all about man and his powers, which is the foundation, which I think is the broad idea that connects all of the things. And I think just, it gives us a deeper appreciation for how we can understand this system and hopefully apply it in our own lives. So thank you.
Thanks, Joya. Sorry about the computer problem. Let me go ahead and restart. It's cloud recording, so that's good. Okay. All right. Next up is Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
Wow. Joya read all the parts I wanted to read, so I'm not going to bore you guys with reading them again. Just going to point out some things that really spoke to me in this chapter. I'm looking at, the garden city, right? For me, I have to agree with Joya that upon reading this chapter, I felt an aha moment, like, oh, the idea is power. Because I had also made the assumption that when we're speaking of the autobiography of an idea, naturally the idea is that form follows function. I mean, we're talking about Louis Sullivan. But in the way in which it's described, Louis' transition into manhood, and it talks about, the way in which that specific paragraph is laid out, it forces one to recall all the previous mentions of power throughout the entire book. And we see this, the power of man, this child's of very, very tender age, his just absolute wonder and his first inklings of what power could possibly be. So we have traveled with this child through adolescence, through all his various methods of study, as he was developing for himself a view of what this word power might be. And in this chapter, it's explained to us that at around this age, post-scholarly studies, he develops his idea of power. And it's not that he developed it. It's more like he concretizes it, because it's been molding, shaping, and forming within and around him throughout his entire life. And so that is something that I got from this chapter. It says the powers of nature and the powers of man, which is another thing that's really important, because we actually see that's fed to us all the way back from when we started reading kindergarten chats. We constantly use Louis Sullivan to point out a shining example of someone who was encouraging us to interweave nature concepts with our day-to-day in order to get more of a comprehensive view of most things. And so looking at that, we're going to, let's use the word comprehensive to kind of look at some of the other things that this chapter is feeding us. The manner in which he does his personal studies here. I'm not going to go too into it, but it's so much like what we are studying here, 5211 Ideas, and what we're encouraging all to do, to go out and just do these in-depth studies personally of those items which interest one. Coincidentally, we just recently did a discussion on, the flow of thought. And in there, it's mentioned that, we're reminded that Sir Francis Bacon tells us that, wonder, which is the seed of knowledge, is the reflection of the purest form of pleasure. And you see that here in this chapter as we're reading the descriptions of how it is that Louis Sullivan goes through his studies in the different philosophies, in going through Charles Darwin, in the scientific method. He's not a scientist, but we see in this chapter how you don't have to be a scientist to get so much out of the methodologies described in using the scientific method, and how you can take something seemingly entirely unrelated from that which is your goal and wield it as a very useful tool for propelling you along your path. And so that I see that here, it's fed to us, very slowly as we see all the things he's studying. And I really do like, and Joya also read this passage to you, but I'm going to point it out again just because I think it's very important, where it says, it is not to be supposed that Louis arrived directly at results as though by magic. Quite the contrary, he arrived slowly, though boldly through the years by means of incessant thought, self-correction, hard work, and dogged perseverance. I feel like these couple things, incessant thought, self-correction, hard work, dogged perseverance, those should be a mantra that we all pick up and walk forward with. Because that, to me, is the goal. That's the way towards the meaningful path, right? That's how we know that we're increasing our, purpose, our usefulness, our meaningful way, is by slowly continuing to move, but you're moving with purpose. There's this intention in everything that Louis Sullivan does. Honestly, that was so not me at 25. I'm just gonna put that out there. But looking at it, it doesn't make me envious. I look at it and I go, I don't know what came before, but I want to make sure that this is what comes going forward. I love the idea of how intentional it is. Even though he's taking the meandering path, he is certainly stopping to smell the roses. He's very well-rounded in his studies, but it's his personal. And again, it brings to mind this idea of, finding flow in thoughts is when you make the decision to take control over that which you will study. It's not a chore, it's not a task, and it's immensely fruitful in a way that it could not possibly be if it were something forced upon you. So we see here in this chapter how everything that Louis Sullivan did was to get him to that day when he was 25 years old, when architect was written on that door. And an interesting thing I'd like to point out is that the way it's stated is it says he arrived at being a full architect to the outside world. And why does he say to the outside world? Because to Louis Sullivan, since he was a teenager, he was an architect. And everything he did was moving him towards that path. That strength of will is incredible. It's almost unbelievable. I understand that Louis Sullivan is a real person, but you really want to look at the book and make sure it's not fiction. It is so amazing, and it's such a desirous thing. And really, it does cause within one this desire to attempt to emulate that, which I think is just wonderful. And if there's something I'm going to be reading, I want it to be something like that, something that makes me say, this, I'm going to strive for this. And it's funny because that's what he's describing to us, that he finds, sparingly, but definitely occasionally along his path. And it's just amazing. This idea of power, it's shown through us that both within, he talks about the powers of nature and the powers of man, but he doesn't talk about the power from within because he doesn't have to. In retelling for us his path along his meaningful walk, he shows us what it is to develop one's will and how one may wake up one day and find oneself living in harmony with one's will. And that's this openness to so many different things, curiosity to integrating them, and the intentionality to continue pursuing it all with a clear goal. I'm really excited to see what comes next. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. That was amazing. Next up is going to be Rupali.
So there's so much packed in this chapter, and I'm really thankful that we have so many presenters because each of us can take a different focus in this. I want to focus on two things. One is getting to know Louis Sullivan as a man. And Maritza, you did a very good job of taking us through his journey from childhood to manhood. And then the second thought is just how does it apply in education, his idea of the engineering design process and the scientific thinking with art and imagination, all integrated in one form of educational system. Because to me, I always ask this question, why am I reading this book and what can I take from this and apply to what I'm doing? And as an educator, I think that is very valuable to me. Louis Sullivan has done a phenomenal job of explaining how he learned and how he studied. So to just start with who is Louis Sullivan? And throughout the book, so this chapter, I've pretty much underlined or highlighted every word, every page. And I have to really choose what do I want to say in this and what is it that I want to tease out. So just at the beginning.
So Rupali, for me, it's the next chapter. This one is highlighted, but the next chapter, it is so highlighted and so many things written on all over the place that I had to buy a second copy because it was just too much on one page. Go ahead.
Yeah, agreed. So, we see how Louis Sullivan looks at calamity, right? We've seen it in the Boston fire with his grandmother passing on. And now he talks about Chicago, and he talks about how people don't give up and the power of will, man's power to will. He brings that back again, and it's going to come back in man's powers and how he kind of crystallizes that idea of power. The other thing is, how is he getting to this process? And you see a man of discipline. So he says daily when he comes to Chicago, he announces this is a place for me, yet the building industry is flat. And he says, irking at the prospect of idleness, he decides to do something about it. Daily, he made his 20 miles or more in the course of a systematic recognizance on foot. When this adventure had come to an end, he knew every nook and corner of the city in its environs and had discovered undisturbed all that had formed the prairie setting of the living garden city, and that had remained undestroyed. So he was disciplined to do something. He was a man of resolve. We've seen this even in his childhood that, he would love to go out and about and discover things for himself. He likes to see things for himself with his own eyes. Curiosity seems to be his ruling passion, again, what he is seeking. And Maritza, you mentioned he liked to smell the roses, right? He would stop everything that was commonplace. He had a skill in deriving joyful thoughts from close observation of what is often called the commonplace. To him, there was nothing commonplace. Everything had something to say. Everything suggested it be listened to and interpreted. And this, he was able to take in, and that quote about taking in, life coming to him, and then life coming out of what he interprets it as. So it's not just taking it in, but also making it applicable.
Rupali, let me comment on this, because that's one of the things that stuck with me. This concept of interpretation, that is huge. Because what he's saying is that reality is what it is. You're trying to understand all of reality. There is no commonplace. It is all part of reality, and you have to interpret all of it. So interpret is a very powerful concept that he has. So you have to take it in, you have to process it, identify what its nature is and what its function is. And then you use that to interact with it. So interpretation is that entire loop. Thank you, go ahead.
Yeah, and he didn't do it alone, right? He also valued men of intellect, and he spent time discussing with them. So this morning, one of the parents sent me an email saying, my son is asking, why do we need to study feudal systems? And I said, okay, let me give you a short answer. And I wrote an email to him about why it's important to study the past and why is it important to understand how government systems work and so on and so forth. And my husband, Rohit, he pulled out some old Hindi songs where the question is, Alexander came and had a war on Indian soil. And so what? What do I have to do with that? I'm living in the 1950s. And we went back to look at some of the poetry from the 1800s in India, which was all ghazals and based on humanity and life. And Rohit said, this is very interesting how people would get together and think of philosophical thoughts in these Mughal courts. And we should have something like that. And I said, we have 52 living ideas to do just that. So the whole thought that, Louis Sullivan did this with many learned men. And Sherry, you talked about the theory of isolated peer foundations and Berman, and you sent me something last night and I couldn't process it at that time. But the fact is that we have this forum, just like Louis Sullivan created his forum to discuss ideas and to test his thoughts and learn from others. So he really valued knowledge, and you can see that. And then he goes about to this whole obsession of learning something that he is seeing for the first time. And again, Sherry had talked about the bridges, and those were phenomenal drawings, Sherry. Thank you for sharing those. So he completely immerses himself. He says he followed each with the intensity of personal identification to the finale of each. Every difficulty encountered, he felt to be his own. Every expedient, every device he shared. The chief engineers became his heroes. Now you talk about mighty men, he's talked about them. They loomed above other men. The positive quality of their minds agreed with the aggressive quality of his own. In childhood, his idols had been the strong men who did things. Later on, he began to feel the greatest power of men who could think things. Later, the expansive power of man who could imagine things. So, from doing to thinking to imagination, he's coming to his own conclusions of his idea of the powers of men. And so he's slowly beginning to form and concretize those ideas. And then he says he saw power everywhere. I think Joy read this and I'll read it again. Louis saw power everywhere. And as he grew on through his boyhood and through the passage to manhood and to manhood itself, he began to see the powers of nature and the powers of man coalesce in his vision into an idea of power. Then and only then he became aware that the idea was a new idea. And so and he was able to, to say, okay, here's an idea, to have the courage to say, I'm going to follow this idea. And my question here that I wrote is, how did he not lose faith? How did he not lose curiosity? How did he keep at it, knowing that it was something new, something different, and that he had to kind of pursue that? He had that intuition since his childhood, and he goes on. So he then puts in a lot of effort. He doesn't just, say, okay, here's an idea and I'm going to write that idea. But he actually goes to study humanities. He goes to study engineering, the scientific method, something that's all new to him. And then takes from all of those studies, he's able to synthesize how he can apply those thoughts to his own proposition. So here he says, you can see the scientific mind, that in the scientific method, there is a search for stability in truth. And he's going to apply that to his work as an architect. So he says, yes, yet science, he foresaw, could not go either fast or far, were it not for imagination's glowing light and warmth. By nature, it is rigid and prosaic. And Louis early noted the free spirits within its field were men of vision, masters of imagination, men of courage, great adventurers, men of one big dominant idea. So again, just having the technical scientific knowledge is not enough. In his book, Kindergarten Chats, he says to the student, logic is not just going to take you, is not going to be the answer for everything. You really need to have imagination. So here we see that, he is patient, he is prudent, he is biding his time till he gets to the point where he becomes a partner with Adler. And during the day, he says, so now he's not just a lifelong learner, but he's a lifelong seeker. And he's seeking the truth, seeking the underlying principles that make everything work in nature and in humanity. So he says, meanwhile, his days were for work, his nights for study, for reflection. And I think this is such a key point that is missing in education. Children are not given time to reflect. They're just going from the curriculum, just, passing things from one to the next. And here's the next assignment, next exam. And there's no time to reflect and no time to think, what did I learn? What can be better? What are the connecting dots that I see in this big picture? So he's able to do that by spending time to reflect, and gradual formation of ideas subsidiary to his main idea, he was consciously now working out alone. This form of solitude did not disturb him. So he was very much at peace with himself. And he goes on to say, thus Louis, while still in haste, felt the courage to go on. he had been reading, and this is after reading Draper's work that Rob so beautifully explained. He had been reading the works of men matured and powerful thought, way beyond his years, but what he could grasp, he hung on to. He felt the enthusiasm of one who is on his way and senses that his goal is real. And you can see this, in youth. My son is 24 years old, and you can see this passion, this zeal for life at that age. You're out there to go get things done, and you're so fascinated by everything. You can see this in Louis Sullivan's, age of 25 years old, architect. And then he goes on to talk about how he's coming up with the idea of form follows function. So I have been debating the autobiography of an idea, the idea whether it is just the idea of power, or is it both the ideas? Because he's putting, he's coming to the conclusion of both propositions, that man's powers as well as form follows function. So he goes on to say, in this wise, the form under his hand would grow naturally out of the needs and express them frankly and freshly. Joya had done the previous passage about how he took away the unnecessary from the architectural design. This meant in his courageous mind that he would put to the test a formula he had evolved through long contemplation of living things, namely that form follows function, which would mean in practice that architecture might once again be a living art if this formula was adhered to. And so I think a big takeaway for us is thinking about design. There was another meetup that Shrikant had hosted, the Design Way, and it's a book written by Harold Nelson. And in that book, he talks about how humanities and science and technology have now been separated. And because they are separated, children don't see that as a unified whole. And what is the educational piece that I take from these chapters is that as we are teaching our children and as we are preparing young adults to be participating in the world, it's important that they have some philosophy of life, that they see humanities, art, architecture, science, technology, all integrated and not as separate compartments, that life and work and art is all integrated. And Louis Sullivan was able to do that at the age of 25, completely on his own, by his own understanding, by his own thought, and that is remarkable. And so, I was going to talk about how he was bold and courageous, which Maritza did a phenomenal job of reading that part about. What can we take from this is to, at the end of it, I feel as an educator, we are lifelong learners, lifelong seekers. And if there's one thing we can take from Louis Sullivan is how he was able to manage his work and his learning. And he says he continued to do that even as he wrote this book. So not to give up on learning ever, I think is my take on this chapter. So with that, I know we need time for breakout rooms. So
yes.
I'll stop here.
So, okay, so here is the problem, okay? The next chapter has 4 times the content as all the other chapters put together, okay? So we have to figure out how we are going to tackle it. So folks, I invite you to start reading it now. And hopefully you will read it a number of times. Please keep notes. We're going to look at it in detail. So what we're going to do is that all the panelists are going to go into a breakout rooms to figure out how we are going to deal with this chapter and what comes next. I've created another breakout room for everybody else. So you're welcome to join the breakout room or leave, whatever you would like. When we come back, we're going to talk about how we are going to do the next chapter. Okay, so starting the breakout rooms now, they will last for about 20 minutes. And then we will come back here and end the meetup. Starting the breakout rooms now. All right. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. So I want to tell you about the chapter, the next chapter, Face to Face. Okay. I'm telling you, it has 4 times the content as all the chapters put together. All right. So how are we going to do this? So firstly, just read it. Okay, just read it. Let it, plan to do kind of multiple passes over it. And what we are going to do is that we are going to read it like Tao Te Ching. That is the best method that we have of doing it. So what we are going to do is we will read out different sections. There are these 3 little stars that separate all the sections. So we'll read section by section. So once we have read a section, all the panelists will be commenting on it, and then we'll go to the next section. If you have any questions, go ahead and type, try to keep the questions very short and type them in, and we'll try to incorporate them. I want to keep, the thing is that if I don't watch out, this is going to go for too many meetups. So I want to keep it chop, chop, chop. At the same time, try to cover everything. We have Rob here, who has never read the chapter and who has a love-hate relationship here because he's a philosopher who is a far more precise thinker than Louis Sullivan. And so at the same time, he appreciates Louis Sullivan, but he will be able to, he has multiple formulations of the same thing. And he's going to be, so it's going to be very interesting to see that dialogue go on. At the same time, Louis Sullivan, there are certainly many things Louis Sullivan is saying that have been said better by other people after him and before him. But there are many things that he's saying which have not been said by anybody, or he's saying something which nobody has said it better. And all of these, both these are fundamental things, both the things where his limitations are and where his strengths are fundamental things. So it's going to be just an amazing, amazing jump at the level of seriousness of the dialogue. So that's what we are going to do. So I just want to, if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to just unmute and speak. All good? All right. All right. And our tentative plan after this, Maritza, you had something, go ahead.
No, I just was wondering if they were allowed to unmute.
Oh,
Joe was making the helpless hand wave.
Sorry about that. Sorry, Joe. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, no, I was just actually wondering, could we ask any questions about the future meetups, or do you just want to go to the end here, or?
You can go ahead and ask questions.
Oh, okay. Like I do have one question. I would just like to actually get Sherry's opinion. She had mentioned how there's this how the architects and this engineering mindset and this architectural mindset that exists today, and there's a separation between the two. And one of the things that we're studying in the design way is that people have become so divorced from the process itself, that they become divorced from the things that they're actually creating, and that has been in such an issue. And that people are no longer designing things, they're just actually building them. So I was just wondering what your take would be as to why. I mean, I know you'd mentioned during one of your dissertations, somebody had danced and got a master's.
Do you remember that? Yes.
I do, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, because
how do you forget that?
Well, I mean, how do you forget that? I mean, one, because I thought, well, I could have done that, but then I realized I can't dance.
You can.
So
you can.
I really hurt that I probably can't do it. So anyway, but that what is the reason as to why that schism has gotten worse?
There's a couple different reasons. Like most of these things, there's a complicated layer of things. One of them is that the architecture industry, the field of architecture has gotten very bureaucratic. For example, every time somebody mentions 25, that Sullivan was 25 when he became a partner, none of you know this, but I'm kicking Rob under the table because it's impossible to do that almost now. Because what you have to do in order to be able to legally call yourself an architect is quite an onerous task. And it kind of tends to grind people to a pulp. You lose the spark that Sullivan has. Secondly, so there's that part. There's the building code industry that has layers of bureaucracy that affect the design to such a point that it's just so much easier to build to the code than it is to build fresh. So there's that level. And then the architecture industry started probably about 100 years ago. I haven't researched the early days of it, but it was a slow transition from architects, in the Renaissance. They were designing siege machines, they were designing bridges, they were doing all of that. And then slowly, part by part, was peeled away. And after siege engines and military war kind of things were pulled off, then it was the bridges that kind of went to the engineers. Then it became, at this time that we're seeing, engineering and architecture are quite tied together when it comes to designing skyscrapers. But when skyscrapers are figured out, it becomes a game of developers and builders, and the architects are really doing the pretty picture on the front, and the engineers are working on the caissons and the HVAC and the structure, and they're completely separated, to the point where you would really draw something and then throw it over the wall to the other department, and they would deal with it completely separately. To give a good example of this, when I was working in Chicago, one of my coworkers, who was several years ahead of me, I don't know that he was really my boss. He wasn't really my boss, but he's kind of a leader in our group. He always said to me, remember, what you're drawing is just a cartoon. They're not really following it in the field. So I was like, whoa, why am I doing this? So there's been layers of that, to the point where architects, even architecture itself. So there's interior architecture, or interior design is now a separate field. Architects don't do that anymore, generally. So it's so parsed up that it's really difficult to pull it all back into one again. Something that's kind of what I try to do with my clients. And I tell you, it's like dragging sandbags, wet sandbags, because everybody is so used to it being done this sort of methodical, we just do what we always do. The builders design the houses, they don't function, they don't make sense, they don't have any thought to the process of the nature of the site, but that's what they do, and the clients don't understand, so nobody quills. So I'm generally doing in my work the teaching that all of these things get pulled back together, and that's where a good project comes from. But so it's many different levels that's been doing that.
And specialization would be part of that, I would say.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
I also think too that the architects, that you talk about how you sometimes have people have this prejudice. Architects, are just, they don't know what they're doing, they don't know how to build, and the architects have shot themselves in the foot in that way a lot of times, because they did become focused on do something weird, and that's what gets you attention. The Frank Gehry, do this thing that looks like crumpled up.
But people, the culture got the impression that architects would double your budget and cause nightmares on the product way before that, Frank Gehry. It was really more, honestly, at the beginning of Frank Lloyd Wright. That's
what happens when you leave a work of art.
Yes, that's what happens. The famous quote that when one of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings was leaking on the Thanksgiving dinner table, his supposed response was, well, that's what happens when you somebody else. That was a guest at the party. Guest at the party.
That's what happens when you leave a work of art out in the rain.
Yeah, but it's architecture. It should be in the rain.
I just want to chime in a little bit here. Recently, we had heavy rains in India during the monsoons, and one of the universities, which was designed by a famous architect in India, was, flooded because he had this idea of bringing outside to the inside and open. And so he had these open atriums, like where the water would just come into, the classrooms. And so literally there was the inside and outside everywhere. But
well, he was successful. The inside became the outside.
The thing is that this whole idea that architects come up with weird ideas and they have this high imagination. The key point that Louis Sullivan is making is imagination is based in reality. Yeah. It's not just pull out something from your head and just make it happen. And I was so disillusioned by the time I was in third year of architecture that I was like, okay, there is no connection between architecture and engineering. And my father's an engineer. My uncle was a civil engineer. So I would see these projects. I used to go with them to their factories and, this large aqueducts and bridges being built. And I could see none of that in the classroom in architecture. And I think the key is that architects and engineers, and I think, Sherry, you had alluded to this in your portion where you talked about how architects and engineers have to be in harmony, and both architects and engineers need to understand each other's fields. And when I first saw that ferrocement staircase that I've mentioned before, for the first time in my mind, I saw a marriage between architecture and engineering. And I saw that here's something that ought to be, that there is this staircase, that's how architecture should be. So I think now when I see architecture in India, the architects, very famous architects will say, I had a dream, and in that dream I saw blah, blah, blah. And then it's that poor engineer's job to make that dream come true. So that's why I think there's this whole disconnect between architecture and engineering. It's too much touchy-feely thing as opposed to here's a concrete idea that needs to be built.
And to tie into what you were thinking there, or what you were mentioning there about imagination no longer being tied to reality, I think we see that in art and philosophy. And that
I see it in politics too.
And in politics. But I think that really
there's a whole song called Imagine that is not very well tied to reality.
But I think that we really see that separation of imagination from reality in the early 20th century in art and philosophy.
Okay, and so you were poking on this. So I'm going to say something about that, which is that ideally what imagination imagination by its very nature comes from the idea of you're rearranging parts that are out there in reality. You're rearranging them in strange and unusual ways and seeing if the rearrangement works. Think of a dream that you have. Generally your dreams are based on something that's happening in your life, but fragmented apart so that things that don't happen together, that wouldn't happen together in reality, happen together in the dream, or something that would be present in reality is not there in the dream, right? Some constraint or a situation. So you think about a dream as being a version of imagination. It's the parts of your real life taken apart and sort of swimming around and making new connections. And that's great, but imagination is, I suppose, fertile when it comes from somebody who is immersed in all the details. Mm-hmm. And you see that throughout history and science, for example, that the example I like to use is the Voyage of the Beagle. This is where Darwin, we just talked about Darwin. Darwin goes on this long sea voyage and goes around the world and observes all these strange and unusual species in different areas, not just the Galapagos, but through the whole voyage. He's making all these biological observations. And it's from this immersion in all these real facts that he's able to then draw this, start to sense that these relationships of how species evolve, and then draw this wider conclusion. And it's also because he's grounded in all those facts that he's able, once he's had the imaginative leap to say, maybe it works like this, he's able to then go back and actually demonstrate that and ground his new idea in those facts that he has. And what we have now is this sort of idea of you can have imagination without facts.
And in many places, imagination is you're yelled at if your imagination has facts. But
yeah, I mean, that's why that description of Louis Sullivan of breaking in from outside and then breaking out, because what you're saying is that breaking in from outside, taking in all of the reality, is crucial part. It's that feedback loop, and then breaking out. You're imagining things, and then even on what you're imagining, you're taking feedback on everything, and that process of going back and forth is creating what you're creating.
And that takes us right back to Montessori education yet again. Because what these children are doing is they're learning things firsthand, like Louis Sullivan. They see it with their own eyes. They touch it with their own hands. That's where their knowledge comes from, not because teacher said, therefore I'll write that on the test. That's
I want to point out one thing, that the point that Rupali, you made about reflection, that children need time for reflection. In this book, the Design Way, in the prelude, he says, look, I have given you text and I've given you these diagrams. The purpose of the diagrams is to move from acquiring eye to reflective eye. So you could go back and forth between the reflective eye and acquiring eye. They are not trying to say the same thing. It's not just capturing the text, but it is a way for you to kind of step back from what you're doing in terms of acquiring the text in order to get a different perspective. And you need both those things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really liked was Joya's framework with the idea of the appreciation of the doers, the thinkers, and then the imagination. It was kind of the ability to be able to integrate everything from your experience, but also it's the appreciation that comes within that framework as well. You're appreciating the people that are actually putting the things together. Then you're also appreciating the thought. So you're taking the theory and you're taking the action, the practicality of it, and you're kind of being able to integrate the two into something that is real. And that's what imagination is, really all about, essentially.
One example I can give of this, just from watching Sherry work, is that oftentimes she does a lot of her design work is done in the stage of actually creating a detailed drawing. So, actually saying, okay, how do these parts fit together, and how is this room going to connect to this other room, and
how many fractions of an inch do I have for the staircase?
Well, yeah, it's a sometimes epic staircase design days where she designs and redesigns a staircase 4 different times, because the reality of you can come up with an interesting idea. Oh, maybe I could rearrange the rooms this way, but that reality, you then have to take that reality and bring it into, can I actually make it work with the widths of the walls and how everything has to fit together and the clearances that you need, and having all the exact details and getting the feedback from trying to do the exact details in a not just in a drawing of like a back of the envelope drawing, but in a detailed drawing where you're putting in all the dimensions and making sure everything actually fits. So it's that you have to have that continuous feedback back and forth to be able to, as part of the creative process.
Ebony.
I think.
Sherry, do you want Sherry? Okay, I'll go. Sherry, do you want to go first, or?
No. I was just saying, Ebony had a question.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, it was an observation. So in the Design Way with Monday night, when we were looking at the video, Dr. Nelson was talking about how the arts, the humanities and science got divorced. So at some point in time, and that if you had a scientific mind, there's no way you could study humanities. And if you were studying humanities, there was no way that that you could have a scientific mind. And that, I think he said it was Stanford or Harvard, one of those where you have to take both. And I think it's so key in that. I think colleges try to do it, but like I know for me, I always thought I did not have a scientific mind. And in a sense, I still have that block. So my question is like, how do you merge those two together for someone like me who has had almost an aversion to science? Not that I don't believe science. Let me be really clear. I believe in science. But have an aversion to learning about it because I did not enjoy it. So I get, that's my question.
I would start by reading Charles Darwin. I think you'd find it utterly fascinating.
Actually, I had a history of science class in college that it was one of my favorites because it was a very University of Chicago thing where you would go back and you wouldn't read a modern textbook about science. You would go read Darwin, you'd read Michael Harvey talking about, I think it was Michael Harvey, William Harvey, sorry, talking about, discovering that the heart was the basis for circulating the blood. You go read the original stuff. And oftentimes it's way better writing and way more interesting than reading a sort of dry modern textbook where it's been preserved in amber and it's been dissected to and made dry and academic and not a living idea anymore. You go back to the original person who discovered this, and it's a new living idea that they're explaining in regular English, because there is no terminology built up yet. Yeah. There's no advanced terminology built up yet in which it would be explained.
So I second that. I think Darwin is a great place to start. And luckily, fortunately, there is even a better place than that. And that is Darwin's autobiography. Because what he did was that he said that I would really have liked to know how my grandfather thought. And I have no way of figuring it out. But I don't want that to be the issue for my grandkids. So he wrote the autobiography to explain to his grandkids what he did and how he did it. So it's very simple, very short, and very powerful. So I would start there and then go to his other works. The other thing I would say is that actually what purports to be science is not science. It is the results of science. And people who are actually teaching science, this is, I think, Ruth Bernstein was here. And he says, I always have problems with science teachers because they hate what I'm saying, because they want the products and they don't want how science comes to be, which is actually very different. I remember when my niece used to complain that, oh, physics is boring, I wouldn't say anything. I would just go to Hartford the next weekend. And I would start explaining to her how things move. Say, okay, how does the fan move? When you walk, what is going on? What happens with the wind? Things like that. And then saying, okay, how did Galileo figured out how fast, how gravity worked, all the experiments. And that's actually how science works, or actually figuring things out. So you need to get a sense of that. And you get some sense of it when you read somebody like Darwin. Some of these, Faraday is another good example. You can see his work also has that quality to it. So that's what I would
read some Richard Feynman too.
Yeah.
Yes, Feynman. Surely you're joking.
That's a great book to start.
Yes, that's
great. Feynman.
Can I just add a couple of things here? So science is actually just doing things. Give me 1 second. Science is actually doing things and seeing for yourself. So one of the things that, much like Shrikant said, my nieces also complain about not able to understand science. And so one of our teachers has been just doing, asking them to measure things. So they're measuring sunrise times, sunset times, and not just taking the data from the internet, but actually going out at sunrise and seeing what's around and jotting that down. And so doing observations and then collecting that data and graphing it and seeing for themselves what's happening. One of our other students is just measuring growing seeds and measuring the growth over time and doing like a little video of that, an animation thing. But then you see the beauty of science and you see it firsthand. And one of our students from high school, when he looked at these scientific patterns, and once you start making observations, you start seeing patterns. And he said, the teacher said, so what do you think of this? And he said, it is so satisfying. I feel that my brain is finally satisfied.
Yeah.
And that was a great observation because, you know, we understand what it means to be satisfied when we are hungry and then we get good food or nourishing food. But these activities are for the brain. And so reading, of course, but doing things for yourself and actually just observing everything around you. Like Louis Sullivan said, there's nothing that is commonplace. And Joya was telling, no, Maritza was telling us how she's observing leaves under a photographer's loop. So you can just do experiments at home.
And
Thank you, everyone.
Baking is science experiments that you can eat.
I do love sweets and carbs.
Can I jump in and say something? I even wanted to share something that was about our topic about how imagination got away from reality, but then I think it ties in with this too. But just to point out what I think is really powerful about Louis Sullivan's framework, which is that it starts with problem solving. And I think that really is key. And I'm going to bring this up again because I still want Sherry or Rupali to talk about this idea of how he even got into becoming, you know, we know him now as the father of the skyscraper. How did it start? The immediate problem was increased daylight, the maximum of daylight. This led him to use slender piers tending toward a masonry and iron combination, the beginnings of a vertical system. And in my mind, I think that really is the key to how you stay reality grounded, is that it starts with an actual problem in reality. And then often the solution requires you to come up with a whole system in order to be able to solve. And this is maybe one of my things, is Ash, who's not here, but said to me once that he always thought the better definition of human beings, more than the rational animal, was the problem-solving animal. And I always loved that because from my background in literature, I always think that there's like the three powerful metaphors for the human being, which is the heart, the head, and the hands. And then it's even perfect that they're alliterative in English. But to me, the problem solving captures all of that. And I love that we see that in Louis Sullivan, that it starts with the heart. It starts with something you desire, some big emotional pull. And then you've got to use your mind, your head to figure it out, and then your hands to actually build it. And then when you have that integration, that's how it all happens.
Do you want me to jump in a little on this right now?
I would love to
if you guys are all
maybe it's just me, but I would love to.
No, it's fascinating. It really is. So remember, we were talking about all these heavy buildings. There's another point in time in architectural history when there's a need for maximum daylight. And think of the French cathedrals, the French Gothic cathedrals. Their structure is then put to the outside so that you can have these very wide spans of stained glass that make the walls look like they have completely dissolved. Of course, the whole point of that for French Gothic architecture was to create it into a sense of otherworldliness, that it was only held up by God. But structurally, it's the same thing. They had to come up with ways to open up the structure to create the maximum amount of light in. But in that particular case, and in French Gothic architecture, the light that they were letting in is coming through all the stained glass.
It's telling a story.
It's telling a story too. But at this point in time, in the late 19th century, in the middle of the city, we were getting a whole bunch of commerce really driving. Think about Louis Sullivan's Carson Peary Scott building on State Street with that beautiful bronze doorway. People were walking by windows. Remember in New York, in Macy's, their Christmas displays in their windows, there was this need to sell their goods, and that window display was advertising, and people would regularly wander up and down the streets, window shopping, and it became a major need for the architects of this time to widen their windows, make more light on the inside. And then for the office spaces, they needed it too, because the electric light, trying to wire them all those office spaces, that was difficult, and you needed airflow because they didn't have modern office building air conditioning situation that we have today. But it really starts in this section of the chapter that he's talking about here, where he's mentioning this increased daylight, maximum of daylight. He's talking about the physical need on the ground floor where people can walk by of these tall structures to have the least amount of structural support. And if you can look up the Monadnock building in Chicago, I've shown the picture before. It's the masonry tower that has sort of a sloped edges. Those windows on the first floor are quite small, and the brick is 6 feet thick, because that's what happens with a masonry structure. So part of that drive for the commercial ground floor window shopping experience was asking architects to make smaller and smaller and smaller structural supports. At the same time, you were stacking stories up and up and up. So there was this new kind of problem solving that needed to, and then of course in Chicago, you're building on a bog. So you've got a problem with extra weight up above and soggy soil below. And there's such a conundrum here. You've got to come up with something completely new. And that's where structural steel comes in.
I want to say one thing, again, in response to what Evanik asked.
Yeah.
And it's a way of giving preview of the next chapter. Louis Sullivan, when he actually examines the culture, what he finds is that most things are actually opposite of what they're purporting to be. So science, what people are calling science, is actually anti-science, because it's a question of form and function. The function of science is to discover. People who are pushing science, calling themselves science teachers, are actually giving you products of science in a way that is stopping the function. So they're actually destroying your science ability by giving you science. He has a very profound idea of feudalism, of basically people using products of a function in order to control the function. So it is, and it purports to be the function. So it is a fraud and it is deadly. I think this applies to a lot of things. It applies to science, it applies to religion. A lot of the religion, what purports to be religion, is actually moving in the opposite direction of true religious direction. And it is done very forcefully. So that is a very large theme of the next chapter. All right, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. See you next Saturday.
Thank you, everyone.
And hopefully before that.
Thank you, everyone. You guys did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.